when reel-to-reel tape machines first came out, people started buying them and walking around with them. They were like this big, but they seemed really portable at the time, and people would carry them around and they would record stuff. What's being captured there is a different kind of literary history. It's not just, say, the work, the poem, it's all of the kind of sound of the sociality, of the engagement, of the community, of the environment, you know, of the context in different ways. So I guess I came to this area of research over a long period of time. And I should say I started at Concordia University. I was hired as a Victorian literature scholar, which is 19th century British literature. Um, and even though as I was completing my first book, sort of in the first few years that I was at Concordia, I was already starting a new project, which was thinking about um, the introduction of early sound recording technologies in the Victorian period, and also, you know, how we might have access to how people read and heard poetry in the 19th century through the few recordings that survived from that period of elocutionists performing poems, or even in a couple of rare cases, authors from the Victorian period, like Alfred Tennyson, reading his own poetry that was captured on an Edison cylinder. So my initial interest in the relationship between sound and literature sort of came to approach literary history through sound media and media technologies. I quickly learned that sort of thinking about literary history through sound resulted in some very interesting challenges, both challenges for the researcher to actually do that research, because sound and sound recorded media are not as easy to work with in some ways as printed words on the page are, but also because it really challenged a lot of the methodologies that I'd been trained in. That basically literary studies for a long period of time, one could say, with methodologies that were introduced in the 1930s and 40s, associated with a field called the New Criticism, it kind of silenced literary studies, and it turned literature sort of almost more resolutely into something that you read silently on the page and analyzed for symbolism, for, you know, everything that we're used to reading literature for now, for the reasons why people find poetry scary, right? Because they don't know what it means, right? And you're supposed to, like, so what does this mean really, right? You know, and it's not enough just to read it out loud and intone what it means, you know, that way, but actually there has to be something more in this sort of silent text that one analyzes, right? But, you know, approaching literature through sound, you know, for that reason, and for the sort of longer sort of critical and methodological bent in literary studies towards the printed page, sort of really represented a challenge to literary studies, one might say, in terms of, well, what happens if you actually extend the idea of a literary artifact to a sonic artifact, to something that one can play and listen to, right? Some basic things that happen is, well, first of all, it's much harder to like quote and analyze and underline and circle and, you know, make arguments like that, right? You can listen to something, but you can't underline that passage and then say, okay, this is what I want to analyze, right? So there are some basic challenges that one might say digitization of these analog media that I was mostly studying, whether it was wax cylinders. Actually, if you don't mind, I have one here, I'll just grab it. But then, like, so what if you get something like this instead, right? I can't study this, right? I need to play it. And when I'm playing it, it's something that's sounding in time, right? Because it's a time-based medium, right? Because it's pulsating, it's vibrating, it's basically air pressure that's happening. And yet you're supposed to capture it and be able to engage with it critically. So there's some real challenges, right? But about engaging with sound as sort of literary artifactual material. But when I came to Concordia on my first week as a professor here in 1999, I was in the then chair's department, office rather, and I saw on his shelf a bunch of reel-to-reel tapes, you know, like taking up a couple of shelves actually. So there were a lot of reel-to-reel tape boxes, and I just said, like, what are those, you know? I was already interested in sound, but I was mostly working on cylinders, not tapes, right? You know, and he said, oh, that's just like from some old reading series that happened here in the 60s, you know. And I didn't think much about it. I went about my business, and I was reminded, something reminded me of those tapes, and I asked him, like, what happened to them? And our department had since moved from the 5th floor to the 6th floor of the library building. So I was afraid, because a lot of stuff got thrown out. I just thought they were going to be trashed. But he said, no, he deposited them with the university archives. So I went to visit them. I went to visit the tapes, and they were sitting quietly in a box, right? Pretty useless as far as research materials go, until you put them on a tape machine and started listening to them. This first collection, which we digitized, I worked with some graduate students. I began to apply for funding to sort of develop these as a collection, and to figure out how to do research on this kind of literary archive, a sonic literary archive, right? And also to make them available to researchers so that others could listen to them and do research on them. And essentially we wrote a catalog, but it became very quickly, I learned the word metadata, and it became sort of it became metadata that would allow us to navigate the audio using timestamps so that it could be much more precisely worked with and studied and analyzed, right? The spoken word project and this chairship, I should say, really emerges as my way of combining sort of the interdisciplinary methodologies that I've been learning through my engagement with sound studies research and theory, with my interest in engaging with this particular kind of sonic literary archive, right? And so it led me to eventually build up a larger team. We did the survey. We learned about other collections that existed. Meanwhile, I was training graduate students through the development of the Sir George Williams collection, and they ended up going to other universities, to Simon Fraser University, to University of Alberta, to University of British Columbia. And they arrived there and they asked questions like, where is your sound collection? Where is your literary, take me to your literary recordings, and often they said, like, what, I don't know, do we have any? And then they found often, yes, they did. And, or sometimes even if they didn't know, we said, yes, you do, because your librarians answered this survey and they told us you do have this stuff. It's not digitized. Maybe you want to digitize it so that person can write her dissertation on them. And so the relationships with some of our partners were actually developed through Concordia students who had started here and made their way to do their PhDs, some of whom have returned here as postdocs now and are working on the spoken word project again. We launched our podcast series last year, and engaging in podcasting as another way to actually try to communicate the knowledge that we're acquiring through our engagement with these collections, and to think about what it means not only to engage with sonic artifacts, but then to create critical artifacts that are, made in sound, right? Has been an amazingly fun and really transformative learning curve for me. And working on podcasts with my students around these materials and thinking about podcasting as a legitimate form of scholarly inquiry, which is something that the director of our podcast series, Hannah McGregor, is deeply invested in exploring. And she has a new grant that's really about that, called the Amplify Podcast Project, which is really thinking about, well, are there ways in which we can imagine podcasts becoming, as legitimate a form of scholarship as an article in a journal, right? For example. And so what are the things that would be necessary to make that happen? And, can we come up with structures for refereeing podcasts, right, as scholarly output?